Economic deprivation, I used the 2010 US Census data. So I looked at these measures: percent living below poverty line, percent on public assistance, percent with less than 25,000, etc. And a summation score was created. And the higher the score, the higher the economic deprivation. With social fragmentation, I used, again, 3 different US Census variables. For example, I used percent vacant housing units, so the percentage of housing that was vacant, percent who have lived in the same house less than 5 years, and percent homeowners within the neighborhood. This was reverse coded because remember, renting is, as opposed to homeowning, is a measure of social fragmentation. And the higher the score, the higher the social fragmentation. So I use multi-level modeling. I use multi-level modeling because the students were nested within neighborhoods. So the multi-level model is a generalization of the linear model used in traditional regression analyses. However, the parameters, such as the intercept and the slope, say of the neighborhoods, are allowed to vary. I used a step-up approach based on Radenbush and Brick. So the first model is 95% plausible value range to be determined from the null model. So the null model only includes the outcome, which is likelihood of being inactive. Then I include the neighborhood level and individual level characteristics. Then I tested sex and neighborhood interactions, and insignificant findings were found, so I'm not going to report these findings here. And then I included the mediators. So I used the Barron and Kenny method for mediation. So in order for there to be mediation, the Barron and Kenny method, these are the criteria that you have to meet. So main exposure has to be associated with the outcome. The main exposure has to be associated with the mediator, and then the mediator has to be associated with the outcome. Then you put them all together, and the association between the main exposure and the outcome should be attenuated or go down to 0. It should be null. So these are the demographics of the participants in the BYS. Just over 50% were female. And so this is just want to remember, this is an urban Boston, this is representative of the Boston students that attend Boston public schools. So just over 10% were white, just under half were black, and just over a quarter were Hispanic. So was there an association between the neighborhood level characteristics? Was there a correlation? So there were some significant correlations. If you look at economic deprivation and disorder, those who were, that's what we expect, neighborhoods that were economically deprived were correlated with being with disorder. Okay. The strongest correlation was between economic deprivation and social cohesion, where you see this negative correlation, which is what we would expect. The economic deprivation was associated with a decrease in social cohesion. So this, I tested the model including all five neighborhood characteristics, and then I also took out social cohesion, but I'm going to present the results today because the results were similar. So I'm going to present the results with all 5 social characteristics. So the null model, which gives us the 95% plausible value range, gives us an indication of variability. So for example, we know that from the sample that 24% of the adolescents reported participating in no physical activity. However, across the neighborhoods, this proportion of adolescents varied from 16% to just under 40% across the neighborhoods. So there is some sort of variability. There's some neighborhood does matter here. So this is the individual level factors. I'm showing these results because I want to see if there are consistencies with our results with the latest with the findings from we find in the literature. For example, we know that females or girls are more likely to be physically inactive, and we found that here too as well. So females were just over 3 times more likely to be physically inactive in comparison to boys, and that the older age groups were more likely to be physically inactive in comparison to the younger age groups. So this is consistent with the literature. Economic deprivation, so those attending, those living in neighborhoods that were high in economic deprivation, there was no significant association between that and physical inactivity. The same as social cohesion, danger, and disorder. However, students living in socially, like high socially fragmented neighborhoods, were significantly more likely to be physically inactive. So they were 1.5 times more likely to be physically inactive. So was there mediation? Did safety and social cohesion, were these acting as mediators between the social environments, so social fragmentation and physical inactivity? And I didn't find any evidence of that. So for example, social fragmentation was not significantly associated with perception of safety nor perception of social cohesion. Perception of safety was not significantly associated with physical inactivity. However, those who felt that they were in a high social cohesive neighborhood were less likely to be physically inactive, which is what we would expect as well. And again, social fragmentation is 1.5 times more likely. Those who live in high social fragmented neighborhoods are 1.5 times more likely to be physically inactive. And when you put them all together, you still get the same result. So there's no indication of mediation. So the next study, I'm going to look at social characteristics at the school level. So I just want to remind you that in the social determinants of framework model, you have schools further down the path. So the objective is to examine whether school level factors, so economic deprivation, social cohesion, social fragmentation, are independent predictors of physical inactivity among adolescents participating in a large longitudinal study in Quebec. So the hypothesis again, school level social fragmentation and economic deprivation are independent predictors of physical inactivity, and school level social cohesion is protective against physical inactivity, and that safety and social cohesion are mediators. So the data comes from the new approaches, new solutions data set. It's a longitudinal data. We started following them in 2002 to 2008. So 70 schools that represented 200 schools from secondary schools and disadvantages communities in Quebec were included in the study. An additional 10 schools from communities of average socioeconomic size were also included. However, data, because they only included physical activity data measurement at 2 time points in the last 2 years, 2006 and 2007, for this analysis, or for this study, I only include the last 2 years. So here's an example. So for the original cohort was started in 2002 to 2003 to 2008, and then but physical activity data was only collected at 2006 and then 2007. And so this is the current baseline, and then this is the follow-up. So just 1 year follow-up. So this slide indicates, just to help illustrate, that pupils or the students are nested within schools. So the outcome was physical inactivity altogether, the question we asked on the survey. Altogether, how many hours a week do you spend doing physical activity? Response options included, I don't do any, and they were categorized into inactive. Everyone else was, they indicated that they do at least 1 hour physical activity, then they were categorized as being active. In terms of contextual factors, so social fragmentation, I used the Ministry of Education of Quebec data so to determine social fragmentation. So these 3 measures, proportion of young teachers, teacher turnover rate, proportion of students dropping out, were measures of social fragmentation. Summation score was created, and the higher the score, the higher the social fragmentation. In terms of economic deprivation, a score was developed using a percentage of families with children whose mothers were without a diploma, and also percent of families whose income is below the low income threshold. Now, the low income threshold is the threshold used by Statistics Canada that takes into account the size of the municipality where the child lives, and also the size of the household, the family. So for social cohesion, I used the scale to create an individual level measure of social cohesion and also a school level measure of social cohesion. For example, so there's a 37 item instrument of 7 subscales, such as relationship between students. So the particular questions asked specific questions about relationship between students, relationship between students and teachers. An overall scale was created. The higher the score, the higher the social cohesion that person or that student individually felt was perceived about their school. So the higher the score, the higher the social cohesion. Now the average social cohesion score for each school was determined, and that average score was used for the school level, to determine the school level social cohesion score. So individual level characteristics included sex, age, nativity, family status, so single versus 2 or more parents, and socioeconomic status. Mediators include perceived safety and perceived social cohesion. So again, I used multi-level modeling because the students were clustered within schools. I did 2 types of analysis. I did a cross-sectional analysis at baseline with just under 15,000 students, and I did a longitudinal analysis with just over 6,600 students. Students were excluded those who were inactive at baseline were excluded because I wanted to determine the incidence of those students who became physically inactive, those students who moved, and those students the oldest students who left high school, who graduated from high school, were also excluded. So at baseline, just over 50% were female, just over 10% were single parent households, and 85% were Canadian born, and that's the age distribution. Now there was no significant correlation between any of the school level factors. So the 95% plausible value range, so again from the null model, we could determine the proportion of adolescents reporting no physical activity at baseline, so the prevalence varied from 2% to 11% across schools at baseline, and incidence, so 1.5% to 9.3% across the schools became physically inactive. So these are new cases. So this is the baseline cross-sectional associations between individual level characteristics and physical inactivity. So again, we see that girls were significantly more likely in comparison to boys to be physically inactive at baseline. At the older age groups were more likely to be physically inactive in comparison to the younger age groups. Socioeconomic status, the higher the socioeconomic status, the more protective it was against being physically inactive at baseline. And those who felt that their high school or secondary school was high in social cohesion was also protective from being physically inactive. This is at baseline. So again, at baseline, high economic deprivation, those attending high economically deprived schools were significantly more likely to be physically inactive. And also it was just marginally significant, those attending high socially fragmented neighborhoods were marginally significantly more likely to be physically inactive. And those attending high socially cohesive schools were significantly less likely to be physically inactive. In terms of longitudinal analysis, so those who are likely of becoming physically inactive, those students attending high economically deprived schools and those attending high socially cohesive schools, there was no significant association, no significant difference. However, those attending high socially fragmented schools were just over 1.6 times more likely to become physically inactive at follow-up. So was there evidence of mediation between of safety and social cohesion being mediators between social fragmentation and physical activity? And I found none again. For example, when I put them all in the model, you still get the same estimate of high social fragmentation. So in terms of discussion, so this is the research gaps Just want to remind you what it was trying to address, the research gaps, and social fragmentation was associated with an increased odds of being physically inactive in neighborhoods and in schools. This results are consistent with previous work I've done that was published in 2012 among Quebec mothers. And those Quebec mothers who lived in neighborhoods that were high in social fragmentation were less likely, significantly less likely to choose walking as a form of exercise. So these associations that I presented were remained after controlling for individual and area level factors, and perception of safety and social cohesion so far did not act as mediators. So implications include, we know from the literature that resources and opportunities for physical activity are important to promote physical